Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Courtney Battle, and I'm the Executive Director of HAND. And I'd like to be the first to thank you for joining us today for the first session in our series on electrification and healthy housing solutions in multifamily affordable housing. We are so excited to be hosting this series in partnership with National Housing Trust, a very longtime member and collaborator with HAND, and just so appreciative of your continued partnership and support. This series will provide technical assistance around common problems that arise during the decarbonization and electrification of affordable multifamily properties. And specifically, you'll hear more about the power of partnership and how housing providers can play a role in addressing environmental justice through our work to create more equitable communities. In addition to convening and providing learning opportunities for our members, HAND unapologetically centers racial equity in all that we do. And we know that goes much further than just creating new housing units, but rather how we really enable our communities to thrive. And so I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to our speakers this morning for your expertise, your time, and all of the preparation for today's session. And with that, I will turn things over to Leslie Zarker with NHT and hope that you all enjoy today's program. I think you're in for a treat. And again, thank you.
So much, Courtney. It's great to be here. I'm Leslie Zarker, Director of Sustainability Policy at National Housing Trust. Next slide. First, just a bit about National Housing Trust. We're a national nonprofit. We work to create and preserve affordable multifamily housing for underserved families. Our home base is Washington, D.C., and we own a portfolio of 4,000 multifamily units across 13 states and D.C. We're also a community development financial institution. I am part of NHT's policy innovations team. And we're a bit unusual in that we combine sustainable development, lending, resident services, and policy advocacy all under one roof. And we do this work to provide opportunity to advance racial equity, reduce economic disparities, and strengthen resilience through practice and policy. Next slide. Today's webinar is Heat Pump and Electrification Solutions in Affordable Multifamily Housing. It is part of a three-part series. It's co-hosted by our DC Healthy, Green, and Affordable Housing program. Next week, on October 31st, we'll present Getting Ventilation Right, Understanding and Controlling Airflows in Multifamily Buildings. And our goal here is to demystify indoor air quality in multifamily buildings and to focus on strategies for retrofitting ventilation systems that control airflow and reduce air leakage in multifamily housing, especially as you plan your electrification of your HVAC systems. On November 6th, we'll have pests, mold, and muck. Super fun topic. Cost-effective strategies to remediate indoor air allergens in multifamily affordable housing. And we'll present case studies there on proven strategies to control cockroach and rodent infestations, as well as to identify and remediate sources of plumbing leaks and water intrusions. So all three of these topics, they really complement and build upon each other. They're integral toward realizing our goals as affordable housing developers to create safe, healthy, sustainable, and affordable homes. So we hope you can join us for all three webinars. And if you haven't already, you can go to handhousing.org's training page at the URL at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. So today we'll hear from our wonderful panel of experts. They've spent many years tackling the challenges of electrifying buildings. They'll share their insights into making these buildings more energy efficient, affordable, and healthier for residents. We're thrilled to have Maria Cecilia Quinones Pena, Associate Director of High Performance Buildings with Elevate. David Traxler, a mechanical engineer with Burns and McDonnell, and Stet Sanborn, Vice President and Mechanical Discipline Leader with the Smith Group. So before they speak, just a little bit of context. Next slide, please. I just want to provide some context for the genesis of our program, the DC Healthy, Green, and Affordable Housing Program, as well as for this webinar series. Next slide. Our pilot projects in the program are to retrofit 6 properties, primarily in wards 7 and 8 in DC, for electrification, energy efficiency upgrades, and to improve health outcomes for residents. Our goal is that nearly 800 families across these properties will directly benefit from housing that's climate resilient, energy efficient, free of sources of indoor air pollution, and affordable. So we'll be taking an integrated approach over the next couple of years to accomplish this. We'll support building owners directly by providing financial and technical assistance. A core part of the project is to engage residents early at these properties to understand their priorities and concerns with green retrofits. And we know a well-trained workforce is critical to reaching clean energy goals, so we aim to create mentorship opportunities for small and minority business contractors in DC. And we're partnering with local community groups, including Children's National Hospital and Children's Law Center, and collaborating with DC government and DC's sustainable energy utility and mission-driven lenders. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is driving this work? Washington, D.C. itself has ambitious climate goals, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption by 50% by 2032, and implementing all electric building code requirements that will lead to carbon neutrality by 2045. And because buildings account for 70% of DC's carbon emissions, BEPS, or Building Energy Performance Standards, are a core part of DC's carbon reduction strategy. DC's BEPS law requires multifamily buildings over 50,000 square feet to meet an Energy Star score of at least 66 by 2026. And in 2027, that standard will then extend to all buildings that are over 25,000 square feet or above. So it's definitely ratcheting up. Next slide. The other driver of this work is the unhealthy housing conditions that lead to poor health outcomes for residents of affordable housing. In July of this year, we were awarded a community change grant by EPA to support carbon reduction and healthy housing goals of this program. And as I mentioned, we're partnering with Children's National Hospital, and we're doing that to target properties with a high prevalence of children with asthma living at the properties. And this slide provides some context for that. 10% of DC's children suffer from asthma, and that's actually quite high. It's nearly the highest rate by state for pediatric asthma nationwide. And even worse, these cases are concentrated in communities of color. So this map on the left shows childhood asthma rates by zip code, with the highest rates in deep blue in wards 7 and 8, which are historically red line districts of DC, where the largest of communities of color are also located. So the Community Change Grant will provide $20 million for these 6 properties to cover partial construction costs, as well as to support TA, resident engagement, workforce development activities, and key community collaboration. Next slide. And so with that context, I do want to emphasize that now is truly a watershed moment in the country for electrification and clean energy upgrades. due to the unprecedented investments for this work in the Inflation Reduction Act. This includes the Department of Energy's home energy rebates, the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and Treasury's tax credits. Next slide. So first, just really quickly with the home energy rebates, this provides $9 billion across the country, according to population size by state. It includes 59 million for Washington, D.C. And we expect DC's Department of Energy and Environment to roll the rebates out next spring, approximately next spring. So for the first rebate category here, home efficiency rebates, for low and moderate income households, these rebates will pay for a customized package of energy retrofit measures, including electrification upgrades of up to $4,000 per housing unit based on an energy audit that models energy savings between 20 and 34%. And for modeled energy savings of 35% or more, the rebates will cover $8,000 per unit, up to 80% of project costs. The other type of rebates here are the home electrification and appliance rebates. And these mainly focused on replacing gas appliances with high efficiency electric ones. These rebates can be used for both new construction and existing buildings. They are appliance-based rebates with maximum caps. So for things like heat pumps or electric stoves, but also includes maximums for weatherization measures like insulation and air sealing, also electrical panel upgrades. So a really good list. These are for households with incomes, rather for households with incomes less than 80% AMI. The rebates cover 100% of electrification costs, up to $14,000 per housing unit. Next slide. The other part of the IRA I just wanted to touch on is the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and focused on, for the purposes of today, we're focused on funding multifamily electrification projects. I'm going to focus on the GGRF's National Clean Investment Fund, which funds 3 national nonprofit lenders to create below market rate, low interest loans and other financing products for an array of clean energy investments in buildings, in transportation, in distributed energy. Climate United is one of these 3 nonprofit lenders. They have committed $3.1 billion to decarbonize buildings. And it has a goal to decarbonize 77,000 multifamily affordable housing units, with at least 60% of those in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Power Forward Communities is another of the national nonprofits. It's also highly focused on affordable multifamily housing, and it's committed $850 million to decarbonizing 11,000 multifamily affordable units. And then the Coalition for Green Capital is the third lender, and it aims to leverage a national network of green banks as its distribution channel for these projects. And finally, I do want to mention the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund's Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. It's another part of the program which aims to ramp up clean energy projects in low-income and disadvantaged communities quickly. And its also central aim is to build the capacity of local community-based lenders across the country to understand how to finance clean energy projects. So there are 5 nonprofit lenders in this part of the program. They're called lending hubs, and they'll be providing capital to each community-based lender, such as CDFIs, credit unions, green banks, and they'll also provide significant technical assistance to help these lenders deploy their funds to projects throughout the local communities. All right, so I would like to introduce our first panelist now. Maria Cecilia Quinones Pena is the Associate Director of High Performance Buildings at Elevate, where she provides tailored services to property owners, managers, and developers to meet their high performance property goals. To date, she's helped nearly 400 properties and 9,000 multifamily units implement energy and water efficiency measures and renewable resiliency, electrification, and decarbonization projects. Maria supports Elevate's Building Electrification program, which is an innovative pilot that supports building owners to electrify multifamily properties in the Midwest. So welcome, Maria.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to this. I'm just really proud of this case study. And so I'm excited to talk about it. I'm going to be talking about how we are decarbonizing a building called Lake Row Village Apartments in Chicago, Illinois. Next slide, please. So really quick, a little bit about Elevate's mission. We are a nonprofit. We're a national nonprofit headquartered in Chicago, where I'm at. And we design and implement programs that reduce costs, protect people and the environment, and ensure the benefits of clean and efficient energy use reach those who need them most. And that's kind of where we center everything. Next slide. So when it comes to building decarbonization, we kind of approached it with very specific goals. First and foremost, we really wanted to end on-site combustion of fossil fuels in buildings, and particularly in affordable housing in the Midwest. It felt like no one was really tackling that. There was a lot of market barriers and things like that, and we just really wanted to figure that piece out. And our overall goal was to do it in the most equitable way possible, all while reducing carbon emissions, all while reducing utility costs, adding central cooling, since heat waves have and are, a public health crisis here in Chicago as well. And then also obviously improving indoor air quality for residents. Next slide. And when we think about decarbonizing buildings, at least at Elevate, we think about it in kind of 4 pillars. And it all starts with energy efficiency, as I'm sure, folks here on the call are aware. Once you have the most energy efficient building, that's when we electrify. And then part of electrification, in parallel to or after parallel to, you add renewable electric supply. So typically in the form of rooftop, solar, and then finally, we support residents in managing their electricity loads by, whether it's signing up for some special pricing program where they can kind of understand when electricity costs are high and they can turn that, washer off, things like that. Next slide. So this is a little bit about the building that this case study is about. And again, my role here in this presentation is to give this case study, and then my colleagues after will really dive into the technology. But I kind of wanted to give the big picture of what it actually takes to do something like this. Lake Row Village is an 8-building, 458 unit property in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. This neighborhood is historically a Black neighborhood, and during the Great Migration, this was like the focus of the Black Renaissance in Chicago. So there's a lot of history tied to this neighborhood, this property. And so you can see 3 of the 8 buildings are 10-story towers, and then the 5 others are 3-story towers. This property is owned by Jonathan Rose Companies, one of our favorite partners to work with because we were so mission aligned. And so when they came to us with this opportunity, we were just thrilled to be part of it. Next slide. So this is kind of outlining the decarbonization process, and I want to dive into the very first step, which is the assessment. Like, we kind of need to figure out what's happening to begin with in order to develop a plan to make it happen. So that started back in 2022. Next slide. And one thing that was really important for both us at Elevate and Jonathan Rose is that these retrofits just cannot increase resident utility bills. And we think, part of decarbonization is really thinking about the people that are living in these spaces. There's a report that came out this summer called The Color of Wealth in Chicago that basically just highlighted the deep inequities in our city when it comes to wealth. And just for some perspective, white families, I think comes to no surprise, have the highest median net worth of $210,000 here in Chicago. And for comparison, Black families have a median net worth of 0. I'm going to say that again. Black families in Chicago have a median net worth of 0. So I know, we're not creating generational wealth when we save a few or $100 in utility bills, but it is not an unmeaningful thing to do and to be really careful. So at the end of the day, we really know that we're engaging with people's real lives and are wanting to be intentional. So this table really outlines kind of all of the things that folks pay for. So heating, cooling, water heating, cooking, and then finally the clothes washer and dryer, and who paid for what before decarbonization and who's paying for what after. So before decarbonization, basically the owner, aka Jonathan Rose Companies, was paying for everything except for the resident who paid for their AC since it's a through wall unit. And then after, basically, that's shifting where the resident now only pays for cooking. Next slide. And so this is such an intense slide, but this is to give you just kind of a visual of what a decarbonization assessment might look like. This is a summary. Every row is a recommendation, and kind of the last few columns are, layout. How much is it going to cost you? Is there an incentive? What does it mean for owner cost savings versus tenant cost savings? That's really important to understand. Is a tenant being hit? Are they expected to pay more as a result of this recommendation? And as you can see, at the very bottom, you see electrification measure 10. And that's where we took a look at electrifying the 5 3-story buildings on the campus. And all in all, we estimated that this is going to cost, so energy efficiency, electrification, renewable energy was going to cost over $3 million. We found roughly $1.68 in incentives. This is again back in 2022. And in this case, no one was going to take a hit, if by no one I mean owners, residents, if all of this was to be implemented. But let's go to the next slide and let's just dive into this electrification measure. Here is, at the very top, you see kind of the total. Then you see EM 10A, 10B, 10C. This is just kind of like laying it out, like electrifying space heating, electrifying water heating, cooking, etc. So, but really the totalizing this made us really think, oh crap, the owner cost savings are really going to go up. They're going to be expected to pay over $20,000 more than they currently are. This is also not workable, even if it means that the tenants are actually saving, marginal numbers, $823 combined. But taking a step back, this is a summary of the 5 3-story buildings. So we said, what if we just tackle one of these 3-story buildings? I think too, it's important to say that back in 2022, even though it's 2 years ago, there was still a little bit of reluctancy from building owners to really dive into electrification. I mean, it's still relatively new. Not everyone in the Midwest is doing this. So I think there is that hesitancy. Next slide. So moving on in the decarbonization process, project and financing and identification, that happened towards the end of 2022. Next slide. And so this is where, again, we went back. Let's just look at one building and let's look at all of our 4 pillars of decarbonization: energy efficiency, electrification, solar, bill management, to really understand what are the impacts here. And as you can see, at the total of energy efficiency, everyone kind of comes out winning in terms of cost savings. The owner saving costs, the tenant saving costs. But when it comes to electrification, that's where you see Jonathan Rose Companies taking a hit of $10,000 annually. The tenants are still okay. When you add solar, that's when the building owner comes out of the red and actually saving, $3,500 according to our models. And even more savings is removing, the natural gas charges, like switching from a normal electric rate to an electric heating rate, things like that, that really help reduce the cost. So at the end of the day, we were able to pencil this out, which is kind of a miracle, honestly. I feel like this doesn't quite happen. It has to be a perfect building sometimes, it feels like, to do this. But we were surprised how, if you really think about this from all angles, it could happen. And if the building owner is willing to just work through this process, it could happen. Another important thing I want to mention is that something we really take pride on too, is that we go out there and find the money to make it happen too. We're not just, kind of sitting here doing an assessment, telling people what to do. We're also on the back end, writing grant applications, finding money. And now with, everything that Leslie talked about with the IRA, like there's just so much more to come that we're able to weave in to actually implement this work. Next slide. And just really quickly, the way we pick the one building out of the 5 to do is just by looking at which building is spending more in gas and using more in gas, and which building just has the older equipment. So we were able to identify our one building, 3526 South Lake Park, as the building to do. Another thing that's not identified here is understanding who the tenants are that live there and their amenability to take change and to move, for a week while construction is happening. That's also really important. Next slide.
Maria, just real quick, I wanted to go back.
Yes.
We have one question in the chat about what is the 13,000 remove utility charge?
Yeah, that's the cost to get rid of your gas bill for the building owner. That's also the cost to change from just a regular electric rate to an electric space heating rate. And I think that's it. Cool. So this is the project scope. Again, our electrification project is just this one building. And it's 16 units, and you can see the list of systems that are in this building, but they're pretty large systems. They have 2 central gas-fired hydronic boilers from 98. It's fin-tube baseboard hydronic distribution system that distributes the heat. 16 in-unit through-wall sleeve air conditioning units in each apartment, 1 gas-fired water heater, storage tank. They had a rooftop unit for ventilation from 1999, 16 gas stoves, and then 4 gas clothes dryers that are shared by the 16 residential units. Next slide. Here's just a little bit more close-up of our building. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to RFP, or request for proposals and bid selection. Honestly, this is probably one of the toughest part. Well, we're in construction. That's also really hard, but this is a really difficult part because, again, in 2023, last year, we're still having a hard time finding contractors that are, submitting bids with equipment that works, that are submitting bids with manual J's, which means that they did their heat load calculations to really show us how they came up with the piece of equipment that they're proposing. So there's been a lot of workforce development that Elevate has also been a part of to make sure that even this small project happens. Next slide. Here's just all the logos of everyone involved, including Jonathan Rose Companies, obviously. Nick and Eddie Construction is our contractor. ComEd is our local utility, who also not only provided funding, but is integral in making this happen. Next slide. So here's the construction scope. I mentioned all of the existing building or existing systems, but really the big one here is that we're replacing the existing natural gas boilers, 2 of them, the hydronic distribution system, and in-unit through-wall air conditioners and rooftop makeup air unit with cold climate air source heat pumps. And there's 20 of them, 1 for each unit that range between 2.5 to 3 tons, depending on whether the unit is inside the building or on the corners. And then 4 cold climate air source heat pumps that essentially condition the hallways and the common areas. And then everything else is just basically moving from a gas version to an electric version, including the water heater, which we switched to heat pump water heater. Next slide. So moving on to design and construction, we started it late last year and we're still going through it. Next slide. Here's just a couple more pictures of what that looks like in terms of, on the left, you have the existing system. So you have your 2 boilers on the far left, you have your through all AC units in the top picture, kind of in the middle, and then your rooftop unit. And this is what it looks like now on the right side. You have your cold climate air source heat pumps sitting on the roof, at least the outdoor unit is, and then the indoor unit is literally laying on kind of the ceiling. There was a can never say this word, interstitial space that's between apartments and between floors that we were able to fit that in. Next slide. Just a little bit more, you have your water heaters on the left, and then you see kind of a pretty classic shared common laundry area on the right. Next slide. Here's your stove. You can actually see the stove that it was replaced with, the all electric stove. Next slide. And then just a little bit more about, we had to upgrade the electric service to the building and systems. And also we decided to pursue retrofitting the ventilation system because there was a huge energy loss happening there. Next slide. And I mentioned this a little bit, but just want to continue that through line of engaging residents is really, really important. And so we had many events where we sat with residents or invited folks to come in and ask questions about what this means for them. And this is kind of a pamphlet that was passed out in several of those events and meetings. And it was kind of really, for me, a really fulfilling thing to do because I got to understand what people really care about. And it turns out, not a surprise, but really thinking and talking about culturally sensitive things that happens in people's spaces, like replacing their gas stove with an electric one, was really important for folks. Next slide. So here's a construction schedule and costs. The total cost of this is $1.3 million to do a full electrification of a 16-unit building in Chicago, starting in 2022. We were able to find grant funding for just about that much amount, which is really amazing. And we actually have had equipment installed and ready. Basically, everything has been done as of December of 2023. And for all of this year, unfortunately, we've been waiting to energize these systems because we're waiting for a transformer from the utility. So that's what's preventing us from electric, or going full electric. We could have done that earlier this year. Next slide. So in terms of challenges, I want to make sure where we are with time. Okay, a few more minutes. Obviously, we wish we could have implemented more energy efficiency opportunities first, primarily speaking about the building envelope. This is a 1970 building. It's really tough to upgrade the envelope to begin with, and we just couldn't find the funds to do that. So unfortunately, that was skipped. If it wasn't, maybe we could have smaller cold climate air source heat pumps to put in there. Comfort can be improved, all of the things that we already know about, but unfortunately, this is just not how it worked out. Addressing utility owned equipment like this transformer that we're still waiting on is huge. I don't know what the solution is besides continue to convene with utilities to talk about how this is a massive problem and a barrier to electrify in a timely way. This property had a particularly complicated utility billing structure. Since it's a campus of many buildings, 458 units in total. And then also, as you all know, when you take up space on the roof to put your heat pumps up there, that means you have no space for rooftop solar. So what do we do? What do we do from there? Next slide. So in terms of next steps, this is my colleague Honey on the roof of one of these buildings. We want to monitor the performance of the new systems. Just as Elevate, we're really invested in understanding how these systems work and how people really engage with them. We want to implement additional measures to further reduce operational costs and actually achieve that cost neutrality for both the owner and residents. Obviously, we want to leverage IRA and other kind of financing opportunities coming down the pike. Identify opportunities for perhaps a parking lot solar canopy to really actually, talk about doing the renewable energy pillar of decarbonization. Continue engaging residents about managing their energy use and costs is definitely on the list of to-dos. And then finally, decarbonize the rest of the property and the portfolio. I mean, that's our goal, to decarbonize buildings in the Midwest. So this was one building out of many that we've done so far. And one building that we've learned so many lessons on and are continuing to. Next slide. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Let's see what the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. That is an amazing project and just such a helpful presentation. We will do Q&A after all three speakers have have spoken. So please go ahead and drop your questions or comments into the chat. You can find the icon for that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to address as many questions as we can. So our next speaker is David Traxler. He is a mechanical engineer with Burns and McDonnell. He specializes in sustainable energy systems with a focus on building electrification, decarbonization, and geo-exchange or geothermal heating and cooling systems for large residential and commercial clients. David holds a master's degree in sustainable energy engineering from the University of Maryland. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. And thank you for that great presentation by Maria. Actually putting it into action and showing what can happen is a wonderful thing. I'm going to talk more, kind of build on what Maria started with in building decarbonization. And you're going to probably own on this call a lot of different types of buildings, from maybe walk-up apartments to multifamily buildings or other things, and have a lot of different systems. So this presentation is meant to give you different ideas of what types of systems you would generally use for different types of buildings. And this actually hits me a lot of the hand of focus very personally, because when I was a young married and had some babies in my house, we moved into an apartment and there was poor indoor air quality in that apartment. And my daughter ended up getting really sick and having to be hospitalized multiple times. We ended up fortunately being able to break our lease and get out of the apartment. But indoor air quality is a huge thing when it comes to living in apartments. And so I'm really glad that this organization addresses that, even though my presentation today does not directly talk about that. So next slide. So one thing we hope this presentation lets you know is you can decarbonize your buildings. You want to question engineers or others who say that you can't. A lot of times it's just they don't know how. The technology is available, the engineering knowledge is available, and there are examples more and more of electrified buildings. So one thing is heat pumps have surged past gas furnaces in sales in the United States. And I think a big reason is they're becoming more affordable and they're more functional. As you see this picture of a heat pump with snow and ice on it, this is a similar style that was used in Maria's case study, where these high heat output heat pumps can be used in more and more climates, and they're significantly more efficient than traditional heat pump systems. Next slide. So when you're designing a building to be fully electrified, you have to do it differently than you did past buildings. So traditionally, you had a gas furnace that you would size for the heating load, and you had the air conditioning portion and condenser unit you would size for the cooling load. But when you electrify your building, a single unit provides both your heating and cooling, and that can vary significantly throughout the United States, depending on where you're building your building or where your building's located. So this is a graph on the right, and it's just showing a small hotel room. But the point is to show, like, in different parts of the United States, how drastically different these loads can be. In Orlando, Florida, you're significantly higher on your cooling load than your heating load. But then in Duluth, Minnesota, it flips, where you need much more heating than cooling. And Washington, D.C., the surrounding area, it's fairly balanced. But this building was modeled as if it were a modern building. Maria referenced that the older building envelopes aren't going to be as efficient as a newer building. So something you have to be really cognizant of is figuring out what's your worst case load and designing your system to meet the worst case while being able to still meet the load that isn't as bad. Next slide. So this is a picture on the bottom left. I like it. It's a Trane heating and air conditioning's test lab for cold climate heat pumps. So if you're nervous at all about cold climate heat pumps, these things are being tested to extreme conditions. In the DC area, you shouldn't have any problem at all if you purchase a cold climate heat pump. On the top right is a performance graph of a heat pump, and this is really important. So if you look at the gray line, You see how the red and gray line intersect at about 47 degrees? That's because traditional heat pumps were rated for heat output at 47. It's most likely because they were originally thought to be most effective in a southern climate. But then as it got colder, you get down to the teens, the capacity drops off significantly. And the colder you get, the heat pump cuts off altogether. And then you go to electric resistance or you go back and forth. So with a high heat output, cold climate heat pumps, you get much more heating at colder temperatures. And that's what this graph is showing, is that you can get full heat pump capacity down to 7 or 5 degrees, or even down to -5 degrees, depending on your unit. And so that's a big thing also. When a contractor comes to you and says, oh, I have this heat pump and we're going to electrify your building, you want to make sure you see, well, will it meet the capacity at the temperatures that are going to be designed for in our location? One other thing I want to mention here is in some cases, your loads can be extremely imbalanced, like we saw before, where you have a very high heating versus cooling load. One thing that's important also is that the equipment be able to meet both those comfortably. And that's going to require typically variable speed fans in your units and variable speed compressors. Almost all high capacity, high heating heat pumps have these, but it's something to be aware of. Next slide. If you're wondering who makes these heat pumps, there's a great resource. It's called NEEP, or the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership. It's a website. You can go on there and they have directories of different manufacturers that make different heat pumps. Right now, some of the most popular are going to be Mitsubishi, but all of the manufacturers right now are working, or not all, but most are working to come out with cold climate heat pumps if they're not already available, because of a big push that's made by the Department of Energy to be able to produce cold climate heat pumps down to -15 degrees. Next slide. So the slide you see now is going to talk a little bit about ground source heat pumps. So ground source heat pumps use the ground as a source of energy to heat and cool your building versus the air. The advantage is the ground temperature stays relatively stable throughout the year. And that's what the graph in the top right is showing, is that this actual project that I was designing and modeling, the ground started at about 53 degrees and it got up to about 73 degrees over the course of the year. And this was in a very cold climate. So if you compared that to the air temperature in that region, it was maybe, I think it was in the zeros or the single digits, and then above 90. So the range of temperatures is much tighter, so you can get more energy out of it and it's more efficient. In the bottom right is some data that I put together from buildings in the Northeast that were high efficiency. And you can see that air source heat pumps are actually very efficient compared to traditional systems, but still even more efficient are going to be your ground source heat pumps. Next slide. Another thing about ground source heat pumps is they can decrease the electrical demand on your building and on the grid. And that's what this slide is showing here. Basically, the COP, what that stands for is coefficient of performance. And a COP of 1 is just like a toaster. It's electric coils in your ductwork, and you put electricity into the coils, they heat up, and the air gets hot. So it's a very traditional system. But if you electrify a building or the grid right now, when converted all the gas units to electric, that the demand or the need for electricity instantaneously would more than double. So when you use high efficiency heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, you become more efficient. You flatten that out. So it requires less electrical upgrades for your building. Next slide. Now, I know a lot of people here may be thinking like, well, ground source heat pump's not going to work for me because I'm in an urban environment, but there are innovations in drilling technologies, and it's angled drilling, where you can actually drill at an angle and utilize more of your lot, even though you might have most of it developed with buildings. The disadvantage to this is it's not available in all locations, but it is available in the Northeast. So, and my understanding is the drillers that do this come down to the DC area. So this could be something that would work for you. Next slide. This is an actual example. This is a 25-story multifamily building in an urban setting. And you can see that there is not a lot of green space around this building. But what we did, or what they did, was they cut out a small patch in the lower side of the lot. And on the upper side of the lot, where there's some trees and a courtyard, they cut another patch. And from there, they spread the bores out underneath the buildings. So even though this building was constrained with a lot that didn't have much space for a traditional ground source system, it was able to provide a significant amount of energy and put a ground source heat pump system in this location. Next slide. And another thing that already came up, Maria talked about, and also came up at the beginning with Leslie, and her introduction was the Inflation Reduction Act, and what a opportunity this is to be able to receive incentives to electrify your buildings. Next slide. So now we got through some of the fundamentals. What heat pump is going to work for your building? We're going to talk about a few. Fossil fuel radiator window AC systems. If you have those in your buildings, what do you do? If you have packaged terminal air conditioners, those are similar to what you see in hotels where they have them under the windows. You have a split system with gas furnace, which is what most of us have. If we live in an apartment or a home, it's pretty common. And an air-cooled chiller with fossil fuel boiler. This is going to be for larger multifamily buildings where they have hot water heating and chilled water cooling. And some buildings I've worked on have also had water-cooled chiller with fossil fuel boilers. So we're going to address each one of these. Next slide. So we'll start with the fossil fuel radiators and window AC or no AC. A few options for these are going to be your ground source heat pumps with fan coils. And a fan coil is just the air handler that sits inside the residence normally, and that has the filters inside that we have to change every 3 months, or supposed to anyway. Also air source heat pumps, which is what Maria used in a similar setup building. Or you could use window heat pumps. Now that's a little bit of a future solution, but right now they're in development of cold climate window heat pumps, where you could, if you don't have any existing cooling or a place to put ductwork, you can put a window heat pump in. Next slide. So the next one is packaged terminal air conditioners. They are developing and have available packaged thermal air conditioners right now that are heat pumps and are working in colder climates. So if you have one of these, you could try one today. You have to be mindful that these require a condensate drain. So whether you drain through the exterior wall, you have to be mindful also where that goes, or if you drain down through a building, you have to know that it's different than your traditional packaged thermal air conditioner that did not require a drain. Next slide. So this is the split system AC with gas furnace. If you have this currently in your building, a great swap would be to go to an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump. These photos on the right are very similar to what Maria just showed you, where you have your condensing units on the roof, and you have your air handlers inside of the residences normally. Next slide. Now this is for buildings with air-cooled chillers and gas boilers. They now have air-cooled chillers that are basically, they're air-cooled heat pumps or air source heat pumps. And on the right, there are images of two different types of units. And so in some instances, it's a one-for-one exchange on those. Typically, these require more electricity than a traditional air-cooled chiller. So it's something you have to be mindful of when you do a swap out. But the air source heat pumps and large chiller configuration would be a good option. Ground source heat pumps still. In a system like this, you may need to add something as like hot water storage. I think Stet's going to talk a little bit more about this in his presentation. And the reason is these large multifamily buildings, the warmest time of the day for everybody is usually in the middle of the day. And so these air source heat pumps can generate the most heat in the middle of the day, but you need the most heat early morning. So in these applications, you may need to add some hot water storage so you can store some of the heat from the previous afternoon and use it the following morning when your capacity of your heat pumps won't be as much, or to offset having to add additional heat pumps on the roof. And in some instances, if you're in a very cold climate, you may make sense to add a boiler backup, right? Electric or fossil fuel. For those few times a year, where it's really, really cold, it could save you a significant amount of money in your upfront costs and your electrical upgrades. Next slide. And the final is the water-cooled chiller and gas boiler. So when it comes to water-cooled chillers, they have water source heat pumps or water-cooled heat pumps. And those images of what they look like is on the right, from large units over 600 tons of heating and cooling, which would be for this high rise or a large multifamily building. For smaller multifamily buildings, they have a smaller size, about the size of a refrigerator, and you stack them together. Now you have to have an energy source for those. So you normally would either use the ground or you could use a supplemental heating source. But that's typically what you would use in this style of system if you switch it out to a water heat pump. Next slide. Now, a few challenges are going to be electrical capacity. It's something that is addressed by all three of us today. And you can get creative sometimes in freeing up energy or electrical capacity when it comes to electrification. If you can afford or to put new windows, that can have a significant impact, especially on your heating load, but your cooling load also. A well-insulated window. Another is just to try to figure out if you have any air leaks in your building. Sometimes if you have a leaky building and you can seal it up, it can significantly reduce your heating load. And another thing is, well, most of the time your tenants will probably have control of their own thermostat, but just education. Like traditionally, night setback has been a great thing for saving energy, but when you have an all electric system, sometimes letting your house get cold at night has a hard time recovering in the morning. So reducing night setback could also be something that you could do. One other thing, and Marie talked about manual J calculations, is that manual J calculations are calculations that contractors use to determine the heating and cooling loads of the building. Well, those loads are good, but if you can verify in the field what the actual loads are, then that's even better. Because then you get a really good idea of how much heating and cooling are actually needed, and then you can appropriately size the equipment, which can make a big difference. Next slide. So challenges are, of course, if you don't have enough money, and that's a real challenge for a lot of owners and a lot of people who do this on their own also. A few solutions are just prepare now by gathering information such as attending this webinar. There are a lot of grants out there right now, and Maria talked a little bit about that, and there are organizations such as hers that help building owners find those grants and get those money. Another thing is to set a system up in place so when equipment fails, you replace it with an electric counterpart. So it's not a significant capital outlay all at once, especially if you have split system gas furnaces in a current multifamily building. As those fail or as becomes time to replace them, a lot of the heat pumps now that are very efficient are a one-to-one replacement where you don't even have to upgrade your service for that unit. And just replace it in stages. Next slide. Now, another challenge is you go to an engineer or put out and the engineer says, oh, you just can't electrify your building because whatever. There are lots of different reasons. So I recommend that you try to reach out to somebody you know that has done this before, ask who their engineer was, or reach out to partners or try to get another opinion on that, because the technology is available today to electrify the buildings. There's also a great guide called the Better Buildings Guide to Decarbonizing Thermal Systems, which is just a fancy way of how to electrify the heating and cooling system in your building. And that recently came out and has good information in it. So just if your engineer says no, don't take it as like gospel. Just try to get more information and find out what's available. Next slide. And I think that's it. Hopefully.
Yep. Thank you. Oh, I just went off screen. Thank you so much, David, and especially for the plain language that you put this in. It really helps us to understand. I just think anybody can understand the concepts that you presented. So I appreciate that. Our next speaker, well, let me just first remind everyone to drop your questions into the chat at the icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to them after Stet's presentation. So Stet Stanborn is our next speaker. He is Vice President and Mechanical Discipline Leader for Smith Group, where he leads the National Climate Impact and Performance Analytics team. He serves on the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRAE's Task Force for Building Decarbonization, and he's been appointed to sit on the newly formed Center of Excellence for Building Decarbonization. He was the co-author of the ASHRAE Advanced Energy Design Guide for Zero Energy Multifamily Buildings and has been a contributor to several design guides related to heat pump applications, decarbonization, beneficial electrification, and grid edge applications. Welcome, Stet.
Thanks, Leslie. So this is great. It's actually, I think the order that we went in today is really delightful because both David and Maria kind of set up both the case studies examples and the technology. And so I'm gonna sort of dig in a little bit to talk about how you might approach your projects to increase the likelihood of success and to tunnel through some of those barriers that both Maria and David mentioned. Next slide. I've led a number of workshops, like all-day workshops with developers and contractors and engineers on their electrification projects, kind of going through buildings they've already tried to electrify, but I also get a chance to peer review a lot of designs that have been put forward and why projects haven't gone forward. So this is actually survey results from an all-day decarbonization or electrification retrofit workshop that we led. And we just asked everybody for their last 3 projects that they were trying to do, what were some of the biggest barriers that they ran into. So it is not shocking if you've gone through one of these projects where cost became a definite flashpoint. But you'll also see that we see, and Maria mentioned this earlier, utility interaction or engagement or some issue with the interconnection side of the project was a close second. Along with just finding where to put all this stuff. Heat pumps are, especially air source heat pumps, typically require quite a bit more space than your good old friend, your boiler, when we do a retrofit. And so we're going to talk through what you might be able to do on your project to avoid or to bypass some of these challenges. Next slide. So the ones from the survey are kind of just a taste of the challenges that we see in the marketplace when we look to do retrofits. We definitely see some additional challenges based on the age of buildings. The pesky electrical service upgrade is a huge challenge, especially when we're looking at turn-of-the-century buildings, mid-century buildings from the last 100 years. A lot of times their electrical service may not be sufficient to do what I would say is a traditional approach of just swapping out a boiler for a heat pump. So we're going to talk through what a better approach might be. And David mentioned this as well about how to hopefully approach your project to right size your heat pumps and not go too big if you don't need that. With oversized equipment definitely comes costs, footprint issues. David also mentioned finding the right design team. This is a huge market challenge. That's why we've been working so hard at ASHRAE to develop design guides and engineering guidance, is to help engineers actually learn how to do these deployments without driving up costs. I'll flag one of the other nuances, and Maria mentioned this earlier as well, is that leasing structures or tenant agreement and leases can radically change who actually has access to the equipment, who's in charge of maintaining equipment, who pays the utility bill. And so those are all part of the discussion of trying to decide which strategy might be best for your project. So, and I have a lot of sympathy for anybody who is waiting on their utility. As I go through my own decarbonization project, I have been turned down for a service upgrade because of where I live. I'm the last string of houses on a row, and they've decided they're not going to upgrade our service. So I'm going through literally the exact same process that I tell people they should go through. I'm doing now in my own home to come underneath an electrical capacity limit and pull all the levers that I can to keep that peak load down. So as we go through this, I'll sort of share out that this really is the way that you have to do it if you're bumping up against some of those constraints. Next slide. So I want to share a case study that was brought to us just actually a couple of weeks ago. So this is a project on the East Coast. I want to say that this one is in Maryland, maybe New York City, but it was a 17-story multifamily building with about 400 units and mixed use ground floor sort of retail. And the owner of this asset is a large portfolio owner, and they have ESG requirements where they are trying to decarbonize their entire portfolio. And so they put a bid out in the street. They had a consultant come in, and the consultant said, "Hey, yeah, no problem. We can totally electrify your building." And so next slide. So one of the big challenges with existing buildings, especially at the unit level, so inside the apartment, are the electrical capacity of the apartment. Oftentimes the building itself might have a capacity issue, but definitely if you're looking at touching inside a unit, we're likely going to run into some challenges on panel sizing. So in this particular project, each apartment had its own load center that was only 60 amps. Now 60 amps isn't undersized at all for a load center. It is for new construction, but for an existing building, we could certainly come up with something. But what they wanted to do at these apartments, besides just the HVAC, is they were trying to electrify the whole building to get off of gas completely. And so they were going to swap out the electric range, or swap out the gas range, swap out the gas dryer, and the central laundry. So they had in-unit laundry, but they also had some shared laundry uses. When they added up all that new load that was going to go into the apartment, you can see that the load count jumped up to about 84 amps. So not enough capacity on that 60 amp panel. So that was the assessment done by the team that was brought in to take a look at it. Next slide. And on the heating side, this building, much like David mentioned, a lot of buildings have a very traditional setup. They've got an air-cooled chiller or water-cooled chiller with a cooling tower and a boiler and fan coils. Very traditional system for multifamily buildings. And so the consultant that was brought in said, "No problem, I can replace that boiler with an electric boiler. No problem." And so buried in the fine print of their report, and you'll see I pulled it out on the right because my eyes started to cry and tear up as I was reading it, that they said, "No problem, we can swap out 3 electric boilers in this project. That's going to bring up additional 1,000 amp power draw for domestic hot water, for the natural gas boiler, or sorry, for space heating, and then for natural gas boilers for domestic hot water, no problem. We're going to need to bring in another 1,000 amps of service." Both of the things are completely ridiculous when we're looking at an efficiency standpoint. And I can guarantee you that if you swap out a gas boiler for an electric boiler, you're going to have electrical capacity challenges, not to mention grid interaction challenges, and not to mention transformer sizing. So if the only thing you take away from today's talk is please do not replace gas boilers with electric boilers, nobody wins. Next slide. The other challenge was when they looked at tracing all that electrical service up into the unit. So electric range, electric space heating, electric dryer instead of all the gas. With that 60 amp service, they were going to have to upgrade all the risers up through the entire building, which is a huge undertaking. And so when the cost estimate came back, you'll notice that the total cost for this project, just to do that in-unit work and the space heating, was going to be about $3 million, of which 2/3 of that were just the electrical infrastructure upgrades. So when we make decisions, we want to change the approach to our project to try to bring in our strategies within the electrical constraints that we have for the project. Next slide. So as we were going through our evaluation, we're like, well, what are some other options that might let us avoid the electrical service upgrade? Rather than maxing out the size of all of our stuff and just shoving it in the building and then expecting the electrical system to respond, what if we found the limit of our electrical system and then worked backwards? So in the event of not having to use an electric dryer, coming onto the market in the last 3 to 5 years, there have been a number of options of ventless heat pump dryers and ventless heat pump washer dryer combos. So there's at least 5 manufacturers now that have these in the market. And the really beautiful thing is, instead of a 220 outlet dedicated circuit, a lot of these systems now can plug into a standard 120 volt outlet, 15 amp shared circuit. So all of a sudden, that huge electrical load, we're like, oh man, that's gonna be a big load. Now, because the heat pump efficiency is so high, you can put a much smaller connected load. So the electrical draw is much lower and can go into a standard outlet. These combo units, heat pump, dryer, and washer, it's ventless, so that you can not deal with any makeup air issues. And they drain, the condensate drains from the heat pump dryer portion down the same drain that the washer would drain anyway. So pretty easy swap out. I have a stacked unit heat pump dryer and washer in my own house, and it let us free up our 30 amp circuit that was there for laundry, and now it's plugged into a standard 15 amp circuit. So now I can charge my car without changing anything. So that's step one. Think about heat pump dryers. It's a much lower connected load. Next slide. In lieu of electric range, this was the other big draw item that was going to bump up the electrical service size. There's been quite a bit of research and new products coming onto the market. There's 2 vendors now. If you're in New York City, it's a separate issue, so we'll get to that. But for everywhere outside of New York City, where the fire marshal will allow you to install batteries inside an apartment, there's a new sort of family of battery integrated induction ranges. The price point is quite a bit higher than an electric range, but again, just like the heat pump dryer, that battery is in there now paired with efficiency to actually get the connected electrical load down below the threshold. So now you can put it in a 120 volt outlet standard 15 amp circuit. Because that battery allows you to flex, if there's a power outage, it's also there to provide backup energy so you can keep cooking even during an outage. So if we think about resilience and storm issues, which obviously are top of mind across the country right now, this is a great solution to, again, limit your impact on the electrical infrastructure and provide resilience for cooking in the event of a storm. Next slide. So if we actually tracked all of that up through the building, we are able to actually save about $1.5 million out of this retrofit. And so that sort of enabling technology, even though the price point of the equipment was higher, not having to touch the electrical infrastructure is a huge win for the project. It means people don't need to move out and they don't have to rip up all the risers going up through the building. Next. Okay, so now we get to that pesky heating and cooling part. So how are we going to do this? Next slide, do this for real. You're going to hear me say this over and over because I see this literally every week when we review projects. Please, whatever you do, don't go into your basement and look at the boiler in your building, read the nameplate, and then just say, I need a heat pump that big. That's going to be a disaster. And I know there's some questions in the chat about what is the issue with the grid. So issues for electric boilers, very peaky, very high draw in a very instant moment because they're not that efficient. To David's point, an electric boiler is effectively a water-based toaster. And so if you think about that, every time you need heat, you're plugging in a toaster and flipping it on full. It's challenging for the grid to mitigate those spikes. It's likely also very much oversized. Next slide. So this is a study, now granted it was on the West Coast, but this is a study of 259 buildings, of which 152 are represented in this graph with all these squiggly lines. What they did is they actually went out to these buildings and they measured the real heating demand for every hour of the year relative to the max that the system was sized for. And the blue line represents the average between all the buildings. And what you see is that most of the time, these buildings are not operating at all close to their peak load. A lot of buildings, especially a lot of existing buildings, their heating system is actually dramatically oversized compared to what they actually need in the building. And we're seeing this true across the country, not just on the West Coast, but also in the East Coast, because gas boilers were really inexpensive. It didn't cost you much to oversize them. Engineers hate it when you call us afterwards and say we did something wrong. So people add safety factors on safety factors and safety factors. And then all of a sudden you end up with a system that's likely two to three times bigger than it needs to be. And this is actually the case in measured buildings as well. Next slide. So one of the things that we can think about as we're looking at electrification, especially if we're bumping up against an electrical limit, is maybe not doing a full electrification retrofit. Hybrid solutions are totally acceptable as we try to decarbonize, especially if we want to stay underneath an electrical capacity threshold. So in this data set, 90% of the hours of the year, all these buildings were below 50% of the peak load design for the building. And so you can put a hybrid together where maybe you use heat pumps to cover that 90% condition, but leave your boiler in place to cover a peak day, peak event, or those cold snaps, the Arctic blasts that come down and sit there for 2 weeks. A hybrid solution is not a horrible solution to meet both your decarbonization goals, because that boiler is almost never going to run 90% of the year. It's just the heat pump and then the boiler's there just in case. Next slide. This is another example. This is actually from a very specific building. So this was measured. And again, you can see the system was designed at 100% capacity on the far right. All the hours of use are in the far left. So 80% of the hours in this particular building were actually at 25% capacity. So way smaller. Next slide. And so my question to you is, well, how much heat pump capacity do you really need if your building isn't actually using that much heating? So to stress David's point, short of doing a manual J calculation, I really, really, really encourage you to take time to go measure your building loads for the year. So if you're not sure when you're going to do your decarb plan, start planning now by collecting the data. Have an engineer come out and throw a BTU meter on if you don't have one, and track your building's use. Because I can guarantee you, if you're bumping up into cost barriers and electrical capacity issues, right-sizing the equipment is going to solve both of those. Next slide. So we like to do data collection first. We then want to follow that up with decarb audits or energy audits to make sure your building's actually working. And then we want to go and stress test the building, see how low you can go in supply water temperatures, and then ultimately pick the fancy high efficiency equipment. But let's start with efficiency first. Let's start with data collection to make sure you're putting in what you actually need. Next slide. And this is kind of the graphic that we like to collect on the thing, and I'll show a bunch more of these in the next 2 minutes. So you can go to the next slide. But something else to double check is that the electrical code actually allows you to go do a panel study as well. So if your engineer comes back and says, oh, there's no capacity in this building because they just looked at your panel, encourage them to go back to NEC code 220.87 and do a panel study. Check to see how much energy you're actually using and how much capacity you have left. It's actually prescribed in the code that you're allowed to overload the panel, provided that you have data showing how the existing usage works. So you might have more capacity than you think in your existing system. Next. So these are going to be rapid fire, but this represents cooling load on the top, heating load on the bottom, and from left to right, January to December. So if I have a traditional chiller and a boiler on the bottom, one option for switching that out, if you go to the next slide, is actually going, what we typically see is people say, oh, just replace the boiler with a heat pump. Well, you can see I've got 4 electrical marks now. I've doubled the electrical connected load of the building. Oh, that's going to cost a lot of money. Is there another option? Next slide. Well, one option is actually changing out my cooling equipment, which already has a connected electrical load, and avoiding adding a new equipment. So just swap out my chiller for a heat recovery chiller or a heat recovery heat pump. That keeps my connected load about the same, but that uses my waste heat that I would dump off most of the year and puts it back into heating the building. This works especially well if you have a hydronic-based building. It saves a ton of money for you operationally, and it gives you a lot of carbon savings. And then the boiler is still there for backup. And if you ever have to replace that boiler, it's likely now that boiler can be quite a bit smaller. Next slide. Another option, David mentioned this one as well, is actually just changing the whole system out to a heat recovery 4-pipe heat pump. Again, this keeps your connected electrical load small, but you're asking one piece of equipment to do two things. So it's working in the winter and it's working in the summer without adding a second piece of equipment on top of that. Next slide. So I just want to stress as we sort of wrap up that start with energy efficiency first. Maybe look at a phased approach before you go all the way to the end and add renewables and do all the fun district energy stuff. But the most important thing is to plan time to collect data so that you're putting in right-sized equipment so you're not wasting money. Next slide. And David mentioned this as well, but I want to just share out some amazing free resources for you and your colleagues. The Better Climate Challenge for the Department of Energy has put out guidance on how to do a decarbonization audit. As part of that, we also wrote a literal Word document with a scope of work that you can put out into the field. And so that scope of work, you can copy and paste depending on how it applies to your portfolio, get somebody to come and do a decarb audit. And if you're working with an engineer who doesn't know how to do this work, please, please, please point them to the Decarbonization of Building Thermal Systems guide. David and I both helped write this guide, and it's a tremendous resource for engineers who are trying to do this work. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all three speakers today. This was so helpful for our audience. It's just really right on target. We want to jump right into questions. So if you have additional questions, please drop them in the chat. I'll start with a question for Maria. First of all, there was a question about tenant reactions. Were there any tenant reactions to loss of the gas stoves, or has that happened?
Yes, I think a lot of people were like, well, then we don't want to go, use people are just most familiar with the electric coil stoves, and those are awful to use. So I think that's automatically where people went. So we essentially said, no, that's not what this is. Let us show you what this actually looks like. And it's a flat top electric model, which is kind of the middle between that awful electric coil stove that people may see in some like affordable housing developments and a fancy induction stove. So we kind of picked the middle ground. And I think, people heard that and they're like, okay, cool. And then on top of that, we reminded folks that the campus has, there's like grilling stations and whatnot. So people still have access to cook with heat in the summertime if that's an option. And people were happy with that. Mostly people were just very excited to get central cooling. So I think they're like, do whatever you got to do to give us central cooling.
Awesome. Question for David. What is the process for manually measuring heating conditions in the field?
So if you have a large multifamily building, it's a bit, well, either way, it's not that hard. Typically, you would hire somebody to come out and put a meter, a BTU meter on your system to track your actual heating and cooling loads. If you have a building that does not have a centralized systems, maybe you just have a split system, traditional type system that most of us have in our houses, you have to get a little more creative. And what you really need to do is you have to go and track data. Basically, you can put a meter to tell you how often your furnace turns on in the winter. And you track that data over a period of time. You want the data when it's dark outside because it's going to be your most accurate. And you track that over the course of a week, 2 weeks. And then when you get that data, you could see like, oh, my furnace is 60,000 BTUs. And on a 0-degree day, it turned on 3 times, 2 hours, and ran for 15 minutes. And then you can determine what your actual heat loads are from that data. So a couple different ways that you can do it. Stead, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Oh, no, I totally agree. That's exactly what I would do.
Okay.
Well, that's nice. Stet, we have a question in general about elaborating on grid challenges and specifically what you said when you said, please don't replace gas boilers with electric boilers, nobody
Yeah.
would.
You'll make everybody cry, especially on the grid side. Um, so if we think about outside of our building, sometimes it's okay if I do something to my building and you're like, okay, it's not that big of an impact to the world. But if you look up and down your street and you're like, well, my building did it, the next building did it, 3 more buildings after that did it, all of a sudden you're looking at some pretty major infrastructure upgrades in the street, in your neighborhood. And so being a good grid neighbor, part of that is keeping your loads as low as you can. And efficiency is a key method to do that. Right sizing heat pumps is a key method to do that. Adding on-site renewables is also actually a good strategy for that. But it's going to start costing everybody a lot of money if everyone just goes in and without thought starts electrifying buildings in kind of a inefficient way. It's going to cause infrastructure upgrades up and down the neighborhood. And one of the big challenges is that ratepayers pay that. So that cost will then get just redistributed through new rate programs. So it might not hit you next year or the year after, but at some point, if we just willy-nilly make upgrades without thinking about the overall cost, it's going to disproportionately hit the folks that we're trying to help the most, because they're going to end up paying for those upgrades. So efficiency first, efficiency first, efficiency first, and electric boilers are not efficient.
Definitely a couple of questions on funding this work. We had a question, are grants available for new green development that's all electric with other green features for multifamily workforce housing buildings? And if yes, where can I find them? I will just mention that I think the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that I talked about in the IRA is a great opportunity for new construction of this type. Specifically the National Clean Investment Fund. And so I mentioned 2 of those groups, Climate United and Power Forward Communities. I'm just going to drop into the chat the link to the term sheet for Climate United, which I think is very helpful. And there's just there's the tax credits that David mentioned that applies to this work, and stacking this together. There's just more and more awareness in financing because of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So I think that's a great opportunity. Maria, there was a question about what grant, what's the source of your grant funding, and maybe you can elaborate on both questions.
Yeah, this was before the IRA came out. We basically convinced a lot of private philanthropic foundations to give us money. It's a mix of that and then the local utility who wanted to prove electrification can be a concept and replicable. I think it's just a moment in time, and I don't think it's going to happen very much again, especially with DGRF and all the other incentives being out there.
And of course, tapping into those local incentives is
yes
as well. You guys have anything to add there?
I mean, the value stacking of incentives, grants. I mean, unfortunately, the way that this is kind of rolling out is it really is a patchwork depending on what jurisdiction you're in. There's some amazing federal programs that you guys mentioned, but really the hard work or the boots on the ground component is figuring out all the ones that can be layered on top of each other to help with different components of the project. And then it used to be that we all of us would say, well, if the efficiency measure pays for itself, then we can do it. The reality is that we don't pay for the climate impacts in our projects day to day. We don't pay for the health inequities. And that never, it's very rare that folds into a conversation on cost. And so we do need to do that extra legwork to value stack funding mechanisms to get this work done so that we can have the impact that we need to have in the communities that we work.
well, we agree with that.
I'm just going to jump to one last question, and then I know we need to wrap up. There's a question, is there a way to use utility data in lieu of a BTU meter to get info on the heating load? Or is the BTU meter the gold standard for data you need to properly size the equipment?
I'll jump in and then David, feel free to share, and Maria as well. I much prefer using a B2 meter because I know it's clean data. I know that it's I don't have to do a lot of interpretation of the data. In California, I can use meter data pretty well because we measure gas usage hourly. So I can pull down my hourly gas usage from my own utility bill. That's pretty good data. A lot of places you get a monthly bill, and they might tell you a peak, but that's about it. And so then you need to look at what your building characteristics are, and there's going to be an interpretation of what the peak load. That's still better than doing nothing. So for sure, I would never not do anything. But if it's possible and you can put into your timeline to get a B2 meter, if not for the full year, at least for your heating season, I really recommend that if you can.
Yeah. And I'm glad you answered that stat. I could see you're biting your tongue there. If you have a split system, it could be as simple as putting a meter, like a small meter on the circuit that serves your unit. And what that'll do, it'll tell you whenever the unit turns on and turns off. And with that, you could say like, oh, my unit turned on for X amount of time on this day, and then it turned off. And so you have that duration, which will help you to determine what your actual sizing is. But I agree with that. When you use a month's worth of data, it's really hard. You end up having to make a lot of assumptions, and it makes it more difficult to figure out what the actual load is.
I think we do have to wrap up now because we are out of time. I'm going to turn it over to Susan at Hand to wrap up.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. This has been really informative and great for me. And I know we still have a lot of questions rolling in. We will share the slides with you if you can fill out our survey. I'm going to drop a link in the chat now, and then I'll also put a QR code up in just a moment. But that survey feedback is really helpful. As you know, we're planning parts 2 and 3. And then as soon as you complete that survey, just to give us some feedback on today's event, you'll get a link to the recording later today or tomorrow, as well as the slides, and our speakers. I know have included some of their contact information in there. So if they're comfortable with you guys sending them questions, I know there's still some going on in the chat and the Q&A, so definitely use them as a resource. Let me go ahead and put up just a quick reminder. We do have parts 2 and 3, Leslie mentioned, part 2 on ventilation on October 31st, and part 3 on pests and mold on November 6th. So if you haven't registered for those already, we'll send you a link in the follow-up about that as well. And then here is the QR code that I mentioned. The link is in the chat as well. If you guys can please fill out that survey. The feedback is super valuable for us, and we do take it into consideration as we're planning these next few sessions. But I just want to thank Leslie and everyone at NHTU who helped us plan today's session and brought these speakers to hand. It was great to meet you, David, Stet, and Maria. It's been great working with you guys and learning from you, and I can't wait for parts 2 and 3. If that's it, we wish you guys a great rest of the day. Do look out. Hand has our holiday mixer coming up on December 12th. So keep your eye out for that as well. We hope to see you in person for that event. Thanks.